Lillian, who comments occasionally on my videos, left a comment recently saying or asking what it means to call a book life-changing. And I think this is an interesting question because actually to say something is life-changing is almost so vague as to be meaningless. On the other hand, certain things, and the arts perhaps in particular, do change our lives. So I think we need to define that. And so I've been thinking about it and thinking about, what books have actually changed me. But actually, to define that, you have to sort of create levels, and I think the levels are. If one is a writer like I am, there are books certainly that have changed me as a writer, and there are books that have changed me as a reader. But have they actually kind of reorientated me? Have they recalibrated me so the world looks different to me after having encountered them? And I think that's the important distinction is once we encounter these pieces of work, are we different on the other side in a, what might be argued in sort of existential way, rather than one where our horizons are kind of broadened or deepened. And I think if someone stopped me in the street and said, what books have changed your life, I would probably throw quite a lot out there, but actually I would just be answering the question lazily rather than thinking about that. So I could say, I could say Proust, I could say Harold Bronte. In a sense, I think Proust had a deep emotional effect on me, and at least for a time had an effect on me as a writer. James Salter absolutely had an impact on me as a reader and a writer, and the same as could be said of Harold Bronte. But was I different after the encounter? And I don't think that was the case. Zone, which I read about 3 or 4 years ago, had a profound impact on me, but I think that was as a reader more than anything else. So the questions I'm asking is are there books, and we can only be changed so much. So in a sense, there are only going to be few books that have this impact. And it's very clear to me which books actually have made me feel that I am in a slightly different world. That I am, as I said, reorientated, recalibrated. That actually, if one wants to reduce the mind to pure materialist object, which I don't, but let's for the sake of a metaphor, almost new synapses or neurotransmitters are formed, and therefore we are different almost in degree and kind at the same time. So anyway, that's my kind of definition that our kind of, to use one of the books or one of the writers, Heidegger, our being in the world has changed, not just our kind of appreciation of it or the depth of our appreciation. We are as I said, differently configured. But I will start. And actually, interestingly, when I I've been thinking about this for a while. Actually, the 4 books I've chosen happened in each decade, from my teens, my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, which means that it doesn't just happen in our formative years. Although I think one could pick out lots of books that had more impact then than perhaps have now, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have all your life-changing books then. So if you've followed this channel or you've read my new novel, you will recognise some of these books because obviously there's a profound effect on them. The first one, where the cover has disappeared, and it is really, look how old that is. My English teacher when I was 14 gave this to me. And it is Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which I've read this translation many times, and I've read other translations. But I think the key thing about this novel is that what changed for me is, I mean, I read it very young, and it's a very powerful book, and perhaps that's all that needs to happen when you're that young. But I think something in the atmosphere of the world changed for me when I read this. The world became slightly darker, but also it had more possibilities, as though, being in the world had more possibilities, and that to be an individual in the world, that one could affect both intellectual and mortal change. And so I was changed, because I thought the world, up until that point, the world had in a sense, the aspect of childhood, but I went from childhood through to something darker and deeper. And so, in a sense, you could argue that it didn't change me for the positive. It changed me in a kind of, I would say, in a kind of value neutral way. But I became much more philosophically minded, probably slightly more pessimistic, which actually goes against my nature. So in that sense, it had that impact. But actually, how I felt in the world was different. And I mean, that doesn't really make, I mean, I'm not being very precise, but it was about atmosphere. My sense of, and I think actually the three books up until the last one, that's what they do share, that aspect. I know I'm not being very clear, but because the second one was my 20s, when I was about 26, which I bought when I was living in New York. I'd never read any Martin Heidegger. He was just a name that was often mentioned in other books I read, and this is called Poetry, Language, Thought, which was the first Heidegger I read. And this had a profound impact on me, because unlike sort of early Heidegger, which I hadn't read at the time, but which is, he was trying to clarify what it is to be in the world, a sort of, to kind of reject Cartesian dualism of kind of subject-object, but actually to kind of place us as a sort of subject-object in the world. In these later essays, he's talking about actually the experience of being, being with a capital B, not our individual being in the world, but the nature of being. Actually, what, as he would probably say, gathers the world to reveal itself to us. And the impact that had on me was that I actually started to experience the world, literally the sort of the concatenation of stuff in the world, I actually started to experience more vividly, rather than just as though I was a sort of, as I was a sort of camera lens walking around the world, and there was a sort of separation between, me as a subject and the world as an object. Actually, it was almost as though I was sort of gathered into the world, comprised of the same qualities as the world, and therefore it was more vivid to me. And in a sense, that's a sort of antidote to Dostoevsky, which I said sort of darkened and closed the world in and made it slightly, almost too intellectually intense. Whereas actually this there was a sort of disclosure of being, which everything made everything more vivid. And then in my 30s, my mid to late 30s, I discovered Wallace Stevens. And this is sort of Wallace Stevens' first collection. He's an American poet who died in the mid-50s. And what Wallace Stevens does is, and I think I can, now when I'm talking, I can kind of see a journey here, is I think with Dostoevsky, I became a kind of, I saw the world in a kind of philosophical, intellectual way. So it darkened and narrowed, whereas Heidegger made everything more vivid. And I think what Wallace Stevens does is he in his greater poems, he suggests that there's a sort of transparency in the world, that things lack a kind of solidity. And so what he enables me to do, I think, when I read him, and why I think I was reorientated, it was that you could almost suddenly look at the world, and it becomes transparent. And there's a moment in my novel when Wallace Stevens, academic, is looking at the church the protagonist build, and it's almost as though she can see. She talks about almost being able to see through the building, and I think that's what Wallace Stevens does. He sort of says that everything actually is in some state of flux, and that we imagine that things are solid, and to a degree they are. I mean, they're not solid to sort of microbes. The world, solid things are just a whole haze of molecules and atoms or whatever. So actually, the transparency is a sort of real subatomic quality, and the flux, the movement is also there. And he, in deeply poetic language, I think he creates a sense that the world is somehow not as stable as we think it is, which gives a sort of vertiginous sense of where we are in the world. So we can kind of imagine that Heidegger kind of creates this sort of vividness, and then Wallace Stevens creates a way of seeing around it. That's a very profound experience of being in the world. And I imagine quite a lot of people, who've taken copious amounts of hallucinogenic drugs feel much the same way. It works for art and philosophy with me. And then finally, in my 40s, and I've talked about this before, I came across just some sermons by the sort of existential theologian Paul Tillich, and his great sermon, "You Are Accepted." This, I suppose, had the most kind of profound effect on me as a sense of my connectedness to what most people call God. And I'm for shorthand God, but I mean it outside of religion or faith. And as someone who's felt like an outsider for much of one's life, and slightly disconnected from other people, and occasionally rejected for being having a certain abrasive manner, this sermon absolutely made a profound impact on me. I mean, yes, I mean, I just recommend anyone reading it, whether you're religious or not. But in a sense, that changed me spiritually. I know it's a clumsy and difficult and ugly word, but it did, in the sense that I felt that I didn't have to judge myself, and I didn't have to worry how people judged me. Not that I've ever really cared how people judge me, but anyway, that I could give myself up to something that would sort of love me unconditionally. So yeah. Anyway, this probably hasn't made a huge amount of sense, but I've tried to give an idea about what books, or how we might be changed by books. And that's it. Thank you very much.